The Consort Tournament by Watermelon's Melon Felon. Chapter 10. Voldemort had tried everything he could think of. The moment Harry Potter's head hit the table was the moment he knew something had happened. The boy did not react to loud noise or physical contact. Voldemort then drenched him in water, but it did not work. He just wasn't responding to anything. And when he stood and started walking off, despite his eyes being closed, Voldemort knew what had happened, and he was livid! Petrifying the teen, Voldemort removed the disillusionment charm that he had been wearing. Ignoring the gasps of the people in the pub, he levitated the boy outside and force-apparated them both through Hogwarts wards and straight into the hospital wing. Madame Pomfrey was there immediately, asking all kinds of questions that he did not have the answers to. And just as Voldemort was ready to scream at the woman, Severus entered the room, followed by both James and Lily Potter, both of whom looked worried. Moving not too far behind them was one Luna Lovegood, who skirted around the adults in order to take a seat beside her unconscious friend. "Miss Lovegood had a vision and came to my office to inform me of it, my lord," said Severus. "I notified Mr. Potter's parents immediately." Voldemort rounded on the blonde, who met his gaze without even a blink. He had intended to question her, but she was already ahead of him. A faint pressure against his mental shields was the only warning he had before he felt himself being sucked inside her own mind. He would have to inquire about how she had managed such a thing right after the vision she wanted him to watch ended. It was the three broomsticks, and both he and Harry were sitting at the boy's chosen table. He marveled over how her sight had allowed her to see directly through his illusion, but he had to focus on Rosmerta as she took Harry's order. The vision followed the woman as she went to the bar and filled the goblet with the drink Harry had requested. One of the waitstaff tapped on her shoulder to ask where the barrels of mead were, to which she pointed towards the back of the establishment. All the while, she never noticed a young man in a brown coat slip a vial of yellow liquid into the goblet she was holding. No one noticed him, actually. He was probably also disillusioned. But Lovegood was a seer, so obviously she was not fooled by his attempts. Rosmerta gave Harry his beverage, and that was when Harry drank it and fell unconscious. The vision ended immediately after that. Voldemort had to blink a few times. Never before had someone forced their way into his mind, only to grab a hold of him and force him into their own mind. And the thing was, Lovegood had full control over the entire situation, and Voldemort had not been able to do anything about it. It was an unnerving prospect, but for the time being, he could let it go because he wanted to help Harry. "Luna," said Lily Potter, looking calm and poised, as if her son was not in possible danger. "Did you see who dosed Harry's water?" Voldemort found nothing wrong with her question, as he wanted to know the same thing. So he didn't understand why James Potter took a very large step away from his darling wife, eyeing her as if she was a venomous tentacula in the flesh. In fact, Severus was eyeing the woman with obvious worry as well.
"It was Mortimer McDougal, Miss Potter. He's a 7th-year Hufflepuff."
James Potter snorted immediately. "A Hufflepuff?" Lovegood only nodded somberly.
"Yes, he isn't very well known, but he's in the tournament, and he's been trying his hardest, but keeps getting outdone by Harry, who isn't trying at all. Basically, he's been jealous of Harry for years, but wasn't brave enough to try anything. And the only reason he tried something was because Harry was actually alone in the public eye, or at least Harry looked like he was alone."
Voldemort seethed, wanting to find the boy and make him suffer. Unfortunately, his plans were forced to a halt when Lily Potter very calmly stated, "He's mine." James Potter took another obvious step away from his wife, and Severus shifted in discomfort. Voldemort would have to look into that matter much later.
"Focus!"
Hermione tucked and rolled. She kept getting lost in her own musings, especially with the revelation of what had happened to Harry. She had wanted to be a part of the revenge party, but Bellatrix insisted that the Dark Lord and the Potters were handling the situation just fine. In the meantime, she needed to practice, and so Bellatrix was putting her through trials. Nothing like Auror trials. Those began with easy spells, like stinging axes. Bellatrix was flinging crucios like they were free sweets. The older witch obviously felt nothing was wrong with it, and after Hermione had been hit the first few times, she learned that Bellatrix didn't do mercy and that the Cruciatus hurt. It was supposed to be a duel, but Hermione barely had time to use any of the spells she had learned. "Concentrate!" the woman hissed just as Hermione was struck in the chest with a lashing curse. The student whipped her wand around and cast Crucio! Bellatrix wasn't fazed in the least and batted the curse away.
You need more control, more understanding. And what better way to understand something than to experience it firsthand?
Hermione barely had the chance to lift her wand in defense. Her shield was quickly overtaken, and the red of the torture curse struck her in the exact same place the lashing curse had. Her teeth cut into her tongue as she fought not to scream, though it was nearly impossible not to. Bellatrix was sadistic and temperamental, but she knew what she was talking about. Hermione didn't really know how to control the dark curses she had taught herself. With acid flowing through her body, Hermione could at least understand what those who were subjugated to it felt. And to be honest, the thought of doing it to someone else was almost exhilarating. The pain relented finally, and Bellatrix levitated her until she could stand once again.
No, I'm going to summon some animals, and you're going to practice my favorite curse on them.
Hermione hoped Harry would never find out about what she was agreeing to do. He'd be so disappointed in her if he did. James and Lily were leaning against a door leading to the hospital wing where their only son lay on a cot. Harry was supposed to awaken soon, but neither had felt too comfortable being in the room because the Dark Lord had taken up residence beside their son's bed, as if the man had a right to be there. In his eyes, he probably did. Lily and James shared a look, though neither felt particularly moved to go and join the leader of their society. While Harry might have been perfectly okay with being around the man and even getting cheeky with him, not everyone would be so lucky should they attempt the same thing. It was simply safer to observe. Lily tugged on James's sleeve and nodded her head towards the bed, where the Dark Lord was suddenly leaning forward, staring intently at Harry. And Harry's eyes were open and staring up at Voldemort without an ounce of fear. "Hello, Harry," the dulcet tones of the dark wizard whispered through the room. It was unnerving how familiar he was with their son. "The hell happened?" And of course Harry couldn't mind his mouth, even in a time like this when the Dark Lord's face was inches from his own. "What do you remember?" the Dark Lord asked. "You stalked me through Hogsmeade and insisted on sitting with me at the Three Broomsticks." Lily slapped a hand over her husband's mouth in order to silence his choked surprise. No need to alert anyone of their presence. Not yet, at least. "Stalking implies that there was stealth involved, and as I was standing right beside you ever since you left the shop, it cannot be considered stalking." Harry snorted. "Whatever you say, you twat." Lily had to rest her forehead on James's chest in order to prevent herself from sighing. The sound would no doubt alert them of her and James's presence. Only her son was so adamant on disrespect. Only her child would look death in the face and insult it. The Dark Lord did not curse him, however. He smirked. That was all. A simple smirk, as if what Harry had said was funny. "Someone dosed you with a poorly made tweaked love potion that made Severus furious." Lily was not imagining the stiffening of the Dark Lord's jaw. She had never understood just why he despised love potions, but she could at least respect that he was very thorough in his dealings with those who used them. Harry gave a wince. "Have you got them yet?" "Not I. Your mother did." Another wince followed by a shake of the head. "Are they even alive still?" The Dark Lord chuckled, a dark sound that raised the hair on Lily's arms. "Unfortunately, I know not what it is that you did, but I confess myself impressed. She located him and did something devious enough that he willingly came and confessed his sins at my feet, tears streaming down his pathetic face as he did so." Harry gave a "I think I know what she did. It happened once before. She uses a rune of her own making and carves it into her flesh. She then carves an exact replica into the flesh or object of her choice, and it allows her a certain amount of control over them or the item. If it is sentient, or has a will of its own, it will be hard to control, but eventually she'll get it done. She most likely manipulated his dreams or something. She preferred the vigilant approach when handling adversaries, after all." Voldemort hummed, though he did not say any more. "Are they in Azkaban now?" And for the first time in her life, Lily saw the Dark Lord fidget. Harry's piercing gaze was trained on the man with expectation, as if demanding the answer he was seeking. "Why aren't they in prison?" her boy asked, his voice taking on that dangerous calm, much like hers did when she had reached her limit. Harry's limit was much shorter, however, like his father's. I decided that torture would be a much better punishment. And Harry was forcing himself into a seated position, batting away the Dark Lord's restraining hands. You cannot flout your own laws simply because you harbor some kind of feelings for the person involved. Then Voldemort huffed. I'm the Dark Lord. I could do as I please. Harry gave a relenting nod. It was truth. Even Lily couldn't deny it. However, you have a position to uphold. The younger generation looks up to you as someone to emulate. Do not prove the words of our parents true. Many people follow you because you are nothing like what we were told you are. One action can cause you problems. You would lose the faith of a good portion of your followers because of this. The Dark Lord stared at Harry for several moments. Neither spoke, they merely stared at one another. Don't you want him to suffer for what he's done? The older wizard finally asked. I want them to get the punishment they deserve for their actions. And since Mom has already had a hand in this, I'd say they're doing time already. Voldemort sat back, crossing his arms in frustration. Several moments passed, with Harry simply imploring the man with only his eyes. Fine, the man relented. He will spend the week in Azkaban. Thank you, Harry said, a small smile on his face. Besides, he continued, if the person in question happens to go missing after they are released, then there's nothing we can do about it, is there? Lily's jaw dropped at the implication, and the Dark Lord had easily understood her son's meaning. Both wizards were smirking at each other now. What a Slytherin way of thinking, Mr. Potter. The Dark Lord practically purred, making Lily shiver. Harry shrugged. Just showing my true colors. I wasn't sure how it would be handled if I let myself be sorted into Slytherin, so I asked for Gryffindor instead. You can't honestly think I'm Gryffindor material. Lily placed a quelling hand over James's mouth in order to shut him up. While she was shocked at the revelation, she didn't want their cover to be blown. Not enough, but you have your moments. You are more Gryffindor than Ravenclaw, that's for certain. Harry snorted. True. And the Hufflepuffs would cower in the face of you. Also true. The two shared a look. Are my parents around? Sleeping in the next room. Lily quickly yanked James away from the door, the two bustling to get back to their conjured chairs. They hadn't been discovered, and they'd also learned something new. Now how to handle the information. Izar stared at the letter he'd found among his little brother's possessions. Looking to his twin, he passed it over. Serpens stared at the words, his grey eyes darkening with ill intent. We keep a closer watch. We handle it if it becomes a problem. Harry was blown away by the very obvious change in the competition. Where once there had been thousands, there was only a little over 100, meaning he could actually see the entire group when he spun around. Hermione was there, and she didn't seem as disoriented as she was during the last task. In fact, she seemed a lot better. Harry wasn't the kind of person to talk, or demand that his friends tell him everything going on in their lives. He preferred for them to tell him on their own, and he had noticed that she had begun to do better over the past few weeks. Already she was losing that manic gleam in her eyes, and he knew that she had not gone to Madame Pomfrey ever since he'd forced her to go. So it couldn't be anything the Mediwitch was able to provide. Whatever it was, though, Harry couldn't help but feel grateful. Sure, the dark arts were enthralling, but not worth losing one's sanity over. He spotted the twins. Both looked confident in themselves, though Fred seemed to be less interested in the task. Since it was centered around showing intellect, Harry had a feeling that they would have to display their knowledge somehow. He just hoped that it wasn't as harrowing as he felt it was going to be. But seeing as Voldemort was in control of the tournament and everything that went down therein, Harry really couldn't get his hopes up. Not when they might be dashed seconds later. Anyway, the twins were never ones for having to show their intelligence on cue. They preferred to march to the beat of their own drum, so this task in particular wouldn't do well for them. Malfoy seemed as confident as ever, which wasn't surprising, and the other competitors seemed agitated. Harry himself wasn't looking forward to the task. Hermione was one of those people who were super intelligent, and she always read up on things that no one had an interest in learning about. So a task like this would cater to her desire to absorb all sorts of knowledge, and that left Harry in a pickle. because Harry wasn't the greatest at theory, as before stated. The fact was, Hermione could very well pass this task because she was brilliant at theoretical knowledge, and Harry might fail. Both were smart, just on different levels. After what had happened to Harry and Malfoy during the course of the tournament, he couldn't afford to just fail now. Also, he was planning to win, just to shove it in the Dark Lord's face that he wasn't going to accept his proposal. It was a pride thing now. Voldemort was present, as always. Beside him was Snape, and on his other side was Bellatrix. They were stood in the Great Hall, where 113 desks were situated around the room in various areas, facing different directions. Harry had a feeling that he knew what was going to happen. "Greetings," the Dark Lord said, nodding to the contestants, "and welcome to the 4th task of the tournament." Some puffed up in pride at his words, others quivered in fear. Harry couldn't blame them. The man was imposing, and his crimson eyes were a little unnerving on such a charming face. "For this task, you will be sitting for your whales. Think of them as a mixture of the newts and wombats, with a little extra information required, courtesy of myself." The devilish smirk that the man was sending their way was enough to terrify everyone, especially since about 20% of them had yet to sit for their newts. WHALE stands for Wizarding Helpmate Assessment for Logic and Equivalence. You will be given a 1,000 question exam and will have 5 hours to complete it. 1,000 questions?! In that time frame, you will have a galleon that will be optional for anyone to forfeit. If you cannot handle the exam, hold the galleon in your palm and it will portkey you from the hall. You will not continue on in the competition if you quit, however. Also, I value intelligence and skill, and for those who are foolish enough to get caught cheating, you will immediately be dismissed. That was definitely a Slytherin mentality, but still, 1,000 questions! And in conclusion, the scoring will go as such, the Dark Lord murmured, waving his wand so that a large blackboard with the scores they would need to achieve appeared out of thin air, floating. The scoring went as follows. D equals distinction, the grade attained when one reaches over the outstanding level. O, outstanding, the grade attained when one reaches the outstanding level. EE, exceeds expectations, the grade attained when one reaches the expectation level. A, acceptable, the grade attained when one reaches the acceptable level. 1,000 plus equals D. 975 to 999 equals O. 950 to 974 equals EE. 925 to 949 equals A. Dear Merlin, the man had some very demanding expectations in his scoring. Out of 1,000 questions, they were expected to at least get 925 correct! The wombats weren't even that long, nor that demanding. Pardon me, I forgot to mention something, the Dark Lord said, a charming smile that would have fooled Harry had he not known the man so well already on his face. There are 5 extra credit questions that can push your grade up should you do well on them. I would advise you to write quickly because they are the only essay questions on the exam, and they are highly demanding. Also, the entire exam is written in runes. The response was utter silence. It was twisted. Terribly so. The man looked properly regretful, but Harry knew that it was all an elaborate act. Voldemort didn't just forget anything. He wasn't the type of person who would forget something of that magnitude. Snape lifted his wand, lighting the tip. Find a seat. If you aren't seated in the next minute, you will be disqualified. They scampered to the desks. Harry threw himself into a seat just before another could, causing the other person to slam into the desk instead and collapse to the floor. He felt bad, but at the same time, he needed all the time he could get, and everyone else could go screw themselves. A moment later, a packet of parchment appeared on his desk along with a quill and an inkwell. With a scoff, Harry reached into his charmed bag and pulled out a fountain pen. Why should he waste more time when he didn't have to? Besides, quills were so taxing when one was trying to take a timed exam. Your time begins now. Harry forced his attention to the exam and nearly blanched. This was going to be hell. Part 1. Magical Law. Points available, 124 out of 1,000. Resources for this section. Ministry of Magic Departments, Wizengamot, MOM rules and regulations, Lord Voldemort's unforgivable list. Circle the correct answer. 1. Which of these is the first unforgivable on Lord Voldemort's list? A. Use of love potions is prohibited within the borders of Great Britain and Ireland, and the use of one earns a week in Azkaban. Possessing one is a fine of 1,000 galleons. B. Anyone found to be in possession of an illegal mixed-bred creature will be sentenced to a month in Azkaban and fined 1,000 galleons. C. Disowning a child for not having magic is punishable by up to a lifetime in Azkaban and a fine of 5,000 galleons. D. Death to any who use potions or spells to force themselves on another being. E. The snapping, breaking, burning, chipping, or destruction, irreparable or otherwise, of another's magical focus, which earns 10 years in Azkaban and a fine of 10,000 galleons. F. Abusing magical children in any way, which is 25 years in Azkaban and a fine of 5,000 galleons. G. None of the above. 2. Your neighbor is concealing a stash of flying carpets, some of which he is allowing to fly loose around his back garden. Whom do you go to when reporting them? A. Wizengamot. B. Department of International Magical Cooperation. C. Misuse of Muggle Artifacts Office. D. Obliviators. E. All of the above. F. None of the above. 3. In 1792, it was decided that blank would no longer take place due to the rising death toll. A. Wastrel. B. The Gathering of Warlocks. C. Hags and Harebrains. D. Waster. E. The Triwizard Tournament. F. Magicals Anonymous. G. Both A and D. H. Both C and E. I. None of the above. 4. There are 52 seats in the British Wizengamot, 2 of which have been unclaimed for the past 4 decades. Of those 52, 3 have been held by the same family for the past 207 years, not to be confused with another family who has held 3 seats for an extended period of time also. Both families are always led by ladies, however, instead of lords. As this is fact, it wouldn't be surprising for one to confuse the two. Which British Wizengamot member currently holds the most seats? A. Lord Lucius Malfoy. B. Lord Sirius Black. C. Lady Amelia Bones. D. Lord Slytherin. E. Dowager Augusta Longbottom. F. Lord Arvent Blishwick. G. Lord James Potter. H. Lady Adelaide Greengrass. I. Lady Vitra LeFay. J. Lord Armando Selwyn. 5. In 1919, which Dark Lord or Lady attempted to force entrance into the British Ministry of Magic but was unable to make it past the wand check registration desk and was subsequently arrested and tried hours later? A. Ceci Whitby. B. John Alexander Croft. C. Gellert Grindelwald. D. Mundungus Maganild. E. Bardo Babcock. F. Papsans Pyrrhus. G. None of the above. 6. On the Isle of Normie in 1974, Lord Voldemort created the first and only blank and had to destroy it hours after its creation, once realizing its destructive powers. He henceforth made it illegal for any other being in the United Kingdom to do the same and marked it as an unforgivable action. A. Dementor/Boggart hybrid. B. Elixir of Death. C. Symbiotic anomaly that required a host, living or otherwise, and enhanced the power of any who bonded with it, but also sucked away their life force. D. Inferius capable of using magic. E. Crystal ball capable of homing in on a particular person and stealing their magic. 7. Who was the magical who held the seat of British Minister for Magic the longest and also passed the law of mixed mingling? A. Millicent Bagnald. B. Ulrich Gamp. C. Basil Flack. D. Artemisia Lufkin. E. Wilhelmina Tuft. F. Unctuous Osbert. 8. In the event of an emergency, who holds primary control over the Department of Magical Law Enforcement? A. The Head Orber. B. The Minister for Magic. C. Lord Voldemort. D. All of the above. E. None of the above. 9. Your friend confides in you that they have been harboring a fugitive within their home. The fugitive hasn't actually been convicted of a crime as of yet, but they are wanted for questioning. What action should you take in regards to this predicament? A. Immediately inform the head of the Auror office. B. Keep your friend's secret. C. Stay out of your friend's business. D. Send the Daily Prophet a letter concerning the situation, but make sure that it can't be traced back to you. E. Offer to help them. F. Trick your friend into confessing on their own. G. None of the above. 10. If you were to go and register an XXX creature, which department would you need to visit first? A. The Department for the Regulation and Care of Magical Creatures. B. The Department of Magical Registration. C. The Department of Creature Welfare. D. None. You cannot register an XXX creature because they are not allowed to be pets. E. None of the above. The entire exam was amazing! Hermione couldn't believe her luck! It was as if finally some good was happening to her in the light of everything going on. While the man seemed unapproachable, Hermione had to give him the respect he deserved because these weren't necessarily well-known facts. It was information open to the public, but it was also things people tended to overlook or mix up occasionally. He knew what he was doing when he created the test, especially with all of the questions being so misleading. Literally almost 100 words to get to the point of the question, and yet the real question itself was only 9 words long! It was devious and admirable, and Hermione couldn't help but giggle every now and then. It was all so brilliant. Why did she love exams? And it was perfect practice for her newts, and the newts had these questions too. The whales were genius. The whales were terrible. Fred had known that this would be the one to get him. The moment the Dark Lord had mentioned an exam, he knew that it would be hopeless to even try. Still, he had persevered anyway, hoping to at least get half of the test correct, but when he neared the 500th question, he realized that he wasn't going to manage even an acceptable. The Dark Lord's requirements were too steep to reach, and Fred, while smart in his own way, didn't spend his time studying the Ministry or the Dark Lord's achievements enough to know the answers to any of the questions in the first section of the exam. That was already over 100 questions wrong, because he hadn't bothered to answer them. With a sigh and a forlorn look sent in his brother's direction, Fred took up the galleon resting at the left corner of his desk and blinked when he found himself standing outside the Great Hall. A knight was there to accept the coin and record his name. "Do old?" the man asked. "Basically," Fred shrugged. "I don't care enough about the minister to be able to answer the first question of the test." The man winced in understanding. "Can't understand half of those questions myself." Fred stretched his arms out, allowing his back to pop. At least he could entertain himself while waiting for George to either pass or fail. From his pocket, he withdrew a nifty little gadget that he and George had created. It was a flute. It actually created bubbles that would pop and play a bit of music before fading out. 2 songs in, and the knight asked, "Where can I get one of those?" Fred looked down at the object and then sent the man a wide grin, pleased to have been asked. "My friend, allow me to introduce you to the owl-ordering business of Weasley's Wizard Wheezes." Extra credit. Write an informative essay for each question. Points available, 50. 1. In great detail, explain Lord Voldemort's takeover from the beginning of the war to the end and beyond. Highlight all key points. 2. Explain why Albus Dumbledore would not have succeeded in winning the war with only his philosophy for the greater good to guide him. 3. List and define as many of the rules on Lord Voldemort's unforgivable list as you can in alphabetical order. 4. Why is Parseltongue not an evil ability? 5. Why is the use of the dark arts not expressly taught in core classes at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry? Harry stared at the result of his exam. Harry James Potter has attained the following grade for his whale examination. 884 out of 1,000. Extra credit, 42. 884 plus 42 equals 926. 926 is acceptable. You will advance to the next task. Congratulations. Harry let out the terrified breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. Marlin, that was a lot harder than he thought it would be. And he'd made it 2 points above the failing grade. Flipping through the packet of parchment, he located all of the wrong answers he had chosen and found himself groaning at the little remarks written beside his poor answers. All of them written in the same elaborate script as the exam itself. Meaning Voldemort had personally graded his test. Harry cast an annoyed glance in the man's direction and couldn't help but give him a two-finger salute when he noticed a smirk being sent his direction. Wank biscuit!
Well done to the 40 of you who managed to pass the exam,
said Voldemort, internally impressed that so many had actually managed to pass his incredibly difficult creation. Harry had just barely managed to pass, his partial credit on the second extra credit question having saved him. Voldemort wasn't shocked to see Hermione Granger claiming an exceeds expectations with a score of 973, which was one of the highest scores. She had originally failed with only a 923, but her essay questions had pushed her over and beyond the limit required to pass on to the next task. Vitra Lefay had managed to obtain a 986, being the only person to achieve an outstanding. She didn't even bother to take the extra credit. Dubois was only 3 points higher than Harry, and that was with all 50 points from the extra credit. The Malfoy heir had a solid 950, leaving him with an exceeds expectations. George Weasley, the only Weasley left in the competition, finished with an even 940, with all extra credit points added. He was obviously the more savvy of the two. Voldemort could assume from his test score that he enjoyed poking around politics every now and then. No one had managed a distinction, sadly enough. Not that Voldemort expected anyone to. A distinction would be his area of expertise. His and perhaps Bellatrix and Severus as well. Barty and Lucius maybe. It would depend. Either way, 40 had passed, which was 20 more than he had expected, which was impressive. Not much could impress the Dark Lord these days. What made him laugh, though, was that some had understood the subtle hint that they were allowed to cheat so long as they didn't get caught. Only 4 who had passed had actually gotten all of their answers due to cheating. One even cheating off Granger, which didn't say anything pleasant for the girl. Still, he was impressed over the abilities to cheat without getting caught and for the ability to pass without cheating. Both were feats of import in his eyes. You will all be advancing onto the 5th task, which is dueling. In order to prepare you ahead of time, we are going to give you a list of the first duels. With a wave of the wand, the scrolls appeared, floating in front of each competitor. You will have a month to prepare yourself to face your opponent. Prepare well because the task will have spectators, and will be held outdoors in a special arena of my own making. With a wave of the hand, he dismissed them. The upcoming months would be entertaining. It is no longer something to be ignored, the old woman said with stunning finality. After the repeated times we have warned you, you have insisted upon such actions, putting the rest of us in danger. You have been disowned.
Reginald No Name let loose a scream that bled into a
tantrum of epic proportions.